Okay, those of you who want Arab control over Israel, the entire Israel, I hear you. And I even hear you, even with the fact that the Arabs actually increased in number from about 100,000 in 1917 to 500,000 in 1948. And I agree with you. The UN partition gave the Jews uninhabitable land that they're already living in, and they kept the Arabs basically in their land. I mean, they gave the Jews desert down here, all this great territory to the Arabs. I agree. Even let's say we're rejecting that. And I agree. The Arabs rejected that plan should be irrelevant. And the Jordanians took all this territory on the other side and they grabbed it before the partition. And let's go say this, even though there was no such thing as a refugee or a quote unquote Palestinian until after the 1967 war, that the Arabs had not attacked in 1967, the boundaries would not have been expanded. Let's ignore that. Let's also ignore that between 1948 and 1967, the Arabs lived in the Arab land, basically, and the Jews lived on the Jewish land. There were no refugees. And let's even ignore that after 1967, it was the same Jordanians that took all this land, that kept the Arabs in refugee camps and used them as political pawns. And let's ignore the fact that time and time again there were peace negotiations and accords that basically promised the Arabs all the land back to the UN partition, and the Arabs kept rejecting it over and over again. And let's ignore the fact that even Gaza was given back to the Arabs. Arab government, the Hamas government, keeps them in poverty. Let's forget all this. Let's even forget that 2 million Arabs are citizens of Israel and hundreds of thousands of Arabs leave Gaza to go work in the southern part of Israel. Let's even leave the fact that the Arabs could go anywhere they want in Israel, and yet a Jew cannot go to their holy site, like the Temple Mount or the Cave of the Forefathers. That's partially banned from them. And let's also ignore the fact that an Arab can go anywhere he or she wants in the entire state of Israel, and yet if a Jew walks into Jenin or Jericho or East Jerusalem or Gaza or any place that's completely controlled by the Arabs, he is going to get murdered. Let's ignore all of that. I will agree with you on your premise that an Arab once lived here. And if an Arab once lived here, the land should go back to the Arab. And not only that, if some Arabs lived somewhere here, then the entire region should go back to the Arab. I agree with you on that premise. If a people lived in one place and a government forced them out, not only they should get the land back, but the entire region should go back to those people. I agree with you. Now let's look at a map. Okay, this is a map of the Middle East behind me. And now this is a much better and bigger view. So 99.9% of this entire territory belongs to the Arabs. Now, let's ignore the fact that the so called Arab refugees were not absorbed into this 99.9% of the Arab lands. And let's agree that why should the Arabs living here in the state of Israel, why should they have to go and live elsewhere even though it's Arab land? And I agree with you. Even if they came from here between 1917 and 1948, like we talked about, even though 400,000 Arabs came from all this other territory to Israel between 1917 and 1948, let's assume that if they lived there by 1948, they deserve to get the land. Do you know that Jews have been living in this entire territory for 2,600 years? Since the destruction of the first temple and when the Babylonians forced them into exile, they were living in this land since the 5th century BCE, and that they were living there continuously since the 6th century BCE. Islam started in the 600 CE, 1,000 years later. Now, there were Arabs before Islam, but they were really limited to Saudi Arabia and over here, this area. They were not living in the entire territory. Jews were. In fact, these lands were controlled by the Greeks and the Romans and the Medians and the Persians. You know who they were not controlled by? They were never controlled by Arabs until 1917, when the League of Nations decided to give sovereignty to the Arabs and carve up some countries. Do you know that the UN came out of the League of Nations? So basically, the same body of Western countries that gave sovereignty to the Arabs also gave sovereignty to the Jews in Israel. That's pretty interesting. Let's look in 1948. There were 750,000 Jews living in this area all over the Middle East. That's right. What happened to the Jews, the 750,000 Jews that were living in this area? Where are they now? Are they still living in Iraq? Are they still living in Iran? Are they still living in Saudi Arabia? Are they still living in Yemen? Are they still living in North Africa? No. Where are they? They were forced out by pogroms, by expulsion, by policies and laws. Now, we agreed before that if a people lived in land by 1948, and of course prior, they should be given back that land if they were forced out by a government, and also the entire region. So, based on your own conclusion, not mine, this is your conclusion, based on your own logic, you have to give the entire Middle East back to the Jews because they were living in the Middle East for 2,600 years and they were forced out by Arab governments. So, 99.9% of the Middle East has to be given to the Jews by your own logic. It's okay. We'll make an agreement. Why don't you give the Jews this little tiny sliver of land called Israel, and you can have the rest of the Middle East in exchange for acknowledgement of the state of Israel and peace? Do we have a deal?